Hi, in this video we're going to look at some techniques for layering drums. So firstly, I'm going to get Vox and Go Spam, which is a free plugin. I'd highly recommend it, which is a spectrum analyzer. And I've chosen to go with snares. I've got 4 of them loaded up into samplers. I'm just using the sampler in Studio One. There isn't really anything other than tuning the samples and playing them back, and the volume envelopes that any sampler will do really. So the 4 snare drums sound like this individually. So I've chosen this 4 snare drum because the other 3 didn't really have much of a tail to them. So the first thing to do is pick a note that you want your snare drum to be in. In this case I've gone with F. So what I've done in the sampler is found F in here. And I've just tuned in here every snare drum to F. And then with the 4th snare drum, I haven't tuned it. In key with the other snare drums, it's peaking at around C. So what I've done with this instead, because I just wanted to isolate the tail of the snare drum, having it in key didn't really matter as much because there isn't going to be any power from the snare drum or any transient or any body to it. So to isolate just the tail, I've used an EQ. So where the main weight of the snare drum is at C, I've cut that out. Using a 24 dB octave bell filter, and then just above it I've got a low cut. So that's taken out all the tone of the snare drum. And then the other thing, because you're still going to get some of the transient from the attack of the snare drum, just use an amp envelope to do a fade in. And now we've got a quite perfectly isolated snare tail that we can use. And the other thing I've done with these first 3 snare drums, now that they're in pitch, the next thing to do is to phase align them. So I've just used Melder Auto Align, which is a great plugin. I would recommend turning down the maximum delay to a low value, otherwise it will move the snares too far apart from each other, which I'll show you in a second. Now it's just a case of click and analyze. And it will automatically phase align the snare drums. So if I bypass them, I'll show you what difference it makes to our snare. So that's with the phase alignment, and then without, you can see that this is a lot quieter here, the fundamental of the snare drum, because of the phase cancellation that's taking place. Like if I invert this, it's completely out of phase. You can see how much of a big difference just the phase alignment can make. I've just bounced all these down to show you in a folder. So this is the snare drums from above, and what I've done is bounce them all down to audio after they've been phase aligned and normalize them just so I can show you what they look like. So as you can see, looks like a synthesizer. Every piece of audio is going to have a wave cycle that repeats itself. With snare drums, it changes in pitch, and same with kick drums, toms, any kind of drum. Generally, it's going to start off high in pitch and drop down quite quickly to create the transient, and then there's going to be some pitch movement towards the end. Generally, with a snare drum, as you'll see, about halfway through, we have this noise that starts, which is the tail of the snare drum. So now that these have been pitched and aligned, you can see they're not going to be perfect because the pitch is changing, but generally they're pretty well aligned. You can see that the wave cycles here aren't perfectly matched up, but they're pretty damn close. And then what I've done as well, I've bounced down, before that, I've done a low cut actually as well on these top snares. If I get spam back up, I'd recommend doing a low cut on your snare drums. As you can see, this stuff down here that's going down to like 50 Hz, this is just going to conflict with any bass in your track and just cause problems. So I'd generally recommend doing a cut around sort of 230 Hz, something like that. So you don't want to cut into the fundamental, but you just want to take out what's below it. In this case, I've done about 196 Hz, seemed to work okay. And that's just taken out some of the unwanted frequencies below our snare drum. So all these snare drums bounce down as one I've got in Edison. And the problem I've got now, in this particular example, where it's phase aligned them, it's moved them quite far out from each other. As you can see, these two snare drums, there is very little difference between them. This one starts just before the other. But to align them to the first snare, there's this big gap at the start. So this section's quiet, then all the three snare drums come in. And what we've got here now is a nice snare tone. It's got a nice tail, but we haven't got a transient to it. I'll just turn down this group so it's not as, it doesn't clip. So yeah, it hasn't got much of a transient at the start of the snare drum. So what I've done as a workaround is I've bounced down on its own one of these snare drums from the start. I just picked out one that's got a nice transient, it's already tuned. So what we're going to do is we're going to use this transient with the layered up snare drum. So it's as simple as just cutting out the transient of the snare. So if I highlight all this, you can just do this in an audio channel. So I find Studio One's a bit frustrating at times for audio editing, so that's why I'm using this. So between the transient and the actual snare drum, it's usually quite easy to see because you'll see where the tone of the snare drum starts, where we have this wave cycles here. So I'm going to cut around here to the end of the snare drum. So we just do cut, and now we've just got the click from the start of the snare drum. which sounds like that. And then we've got our other snare drum here. So what I'm going to do is just choose where the wave cycle starts on this snare drum, or somewhere around. So I'm going to choose from there and go to the end of the snare drum, and then we just click copy, and then we highlight the very end of the snare drum, and we go into here and we click paste insert, and for some reason that has not gone to plan. There we go. So now we've got the transient that was already pitched and the body and tail of the snare drum all together. So that sounds like this. I'm quite happy with that. It's really subjective with snares to how you want them to sound. It'll depend a lot on the genre of music you're working in. But that's how you isolate tails of snare drums, how you can replace transients, just by using some simple methods, and how you can get different layers to really gel together. And this is something I'd recommend as well. Just copying and pasting transients is great. If you've got a transient and it's really not working, just those first few milliseconds of a snare drum, you can spend a lot of time messing around with plugins, but just by replacing it, a lot of the time it's just a lot quicker and a lot easier if you just find a snare drum that's got a nice transient